The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time they had never faced an enemy they could not defeat or bargain with, or simply outlast through patience and superior numbers. But the Vorn Collective changed everything when they emerged from the darkness beyond the mapped regions of space. Commander Ethan Cole stood on the observation deck of Earth Station Alpha and watched a Kalari shuttle approach through the void. And he knew before anyone told him that this visit meant trouble, because the Kalari never came to Earth unless they wanted something from the humans they considered beneath their notice. The Kalari ambassador was tall, with silver skin that seemed to glow faintly in the station lights, and 4 arms that moved with unsettling grace. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of desperation that her species had never shown to humans before. "We require your assistance, Commander Cole," she said, and the words seemed to pain her as though asking humans for help was an admission of failure that cut deep into her pride. Ethan listened as she explained what the Vorn had done to 17 species, and how entire star systems had been consumed, and how the combined fleets of the Galactic Council had been scattered like dust in every battle they had fought. "Why come to us?" he asked, because he needed to hear her say it out loud, after 30 years of humans being treated like children who had stumbled into a gathering of adults. "Because you fight differently," she admitted, and her 4 hands clasped together in what Ethan recognized as a gesture of shame among her people. "And we have watched your history and your wars, and we have seen that you do not retreat when logic demands it, and you do not calculate acceptable losses the way we do, and some call this madness, but we are hoping it is something else." Ethan took the reports she offered and spent the night reading them alone in his quarters. Images of burning worlds and dying fleets kept him awake until dawn. Admiral Patricia Hayes had served the Earth Defense Fleet for 40 years, and she had fought to earn humanity a place among the stars, only to watch the Council species look down on her people again and again. And when Ethan brought her the Kalari request, she listened with a face that grew harder with each word. "They ignored us," she said when he finished, "and they denied us their technology, and they treated our diplomats like fools, and now they want our blood to save their worlds." "Yes, Admiral," Ethan replied, and he did not argue, because everything she said was true. Patricia stood and walked to the window and looked down at Earth below, where billions of people lived their lives, unaware of the darkness coming for them, and she was silent for a long time before she spoke again. "Prepare the fleet," she said finally, "and if these Vorn are going to reach us eventually, then I would rather meet them out there than watch them burn our home." The call for volunteers went out across Earth and its colonies, and Ethan expected a few thousand brave souls to answer. But instead, millions came forward, and recruitment centers were overwhelmed with men and women who had never considered military service before. Maya Torres was 26 years old, and she had been an engineer on a cargo ship before the call came. And she signed up because her grandmother had always told her that when evil comes, you do not hide from it. You stand up and face it, even if you are afraid. She found herself assigned to the carrier Endurance as a tactical officer, and on the day the fleet departed, she stood on the bridge beside Commander Cole and watched Earth shrink behind them until it was just another star among millions. "The Kalari fleet is transmitting coordinates," she reported, "and they seem surprised we actually came." Ethan smiled, but there was no humor in it, only a grim determination that Maya would come to recognize in the weeks ahead. "They will be more surprised before this is over," he said, "and one way or another." The journey to the rendezvous point took 3 weeks, and during that time, Ethan trained his people harder than they had ever been trained, and he studied every report on the Vorn that the Council had provided. And he began to understand why the galaxy was losing this war. The Council species were old and wise, and they had forgotten what it meant to fight for survival, because they had not faced true extinction in thousands of years. And their tactics were designed to minimize losses rather than achieve victory. and they treated war like a mathematics problem that could be solved with the right equation. Humans did not think that way, and Ethan knew it was both their greatest weakness and their greatest strength. Maya came to him the night before they reached the fleet gathering point, and she found him alone in the observation lounge, staring out at the stars. "Are we going to win?" she asked, and she did not try to hide the fear in her voice, because there was no shame in being afraid when you were flying toward an enemy that had destroyed 17 species. "I do not know," Ethan admitted, and he turned to face her, and in the dim light she could see the weight he carried in his eyes, and the burden of all the lives that depended on his decisions. "Then why are we doing this?" she asked. "Because sometimes the question is not whether you will win," he said, "and sometimes the question is whether the fight is worth fighting, and whether there are things more important than survival. And I believe there are." Maya thought about his words as she returned to her quarters, and she thought about her grandmother, who had survived a war on Earth long ago, and who had told her stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they refused to let darkness win. The fleet arrived at the Pereth system and found the Council Armada waiting, and there were ships from dozens of species gathered in a formation that should have been impressive, but instead looked fragile against the endless dark. Admiral Veth Sora of the Kalari hailed the Endurance and welcomed the human contingent with words that were polite but carried an undercurrent of doubt. And Ethan understood that the Council still did not truly believe that these primitive newcomers could make a difference. He would show them otherwise, or die trying. That night, Maya found Ethan in the ship chapel, where a few crew members gathered to pray or simply sit in silence, and she sat beside him, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "What are you thinking about?" she finally asked. "I am thinking about everyone back home," Ethan said, "and I am thinking about all the people who will never know what we did out here. And I am thinking that it does not matter whether anyone remembers us, because what matters is that we stood up when standing up was hard." Maya nodded, and she understood then why people followed this man, and why they would follow him into the darkness ahead. The Vorn were coming, and the galaxy was afraid, and humanity was about to show them all what it meant to fight, not because victory was certain, but because the fight itself was worth everything they had to give. The strategic briefing took place aboard the Kalari flagship, and Ethan walked through corridors that seemed to glow with an inner light. And he passed beings from species he had only read about in reports, and most of them looked at the human delegation with eyes that held skepticism or pity or both. Admiral Vetsora stood at the center of a massive holographic display that showed the Pereth system in perfect detail, and around her gathered commanders from 30 different species. And Ethan noted how they positioned themselves with the Kalari at the center, and the humans pushed to the edges like afterthoughts. "The plan is simple," Vetsora said, and her voice carried the confidence of someone who had commanded fleets for centuries. "And we will establish a defensive perimeter at the 3rd orbital position, and engage the Vorn with concentrated fire while maintaining formation discipline. And we will hold the line until they exhaust their forces against our combined strength." Ethan listened, and he studied the tactical projections, and he saw exactly why the Council had lost every major engagement against the Vorn, because they were fighting a defensive war against an enemy that did not care about losses. "Permission to speak," he said, and the room fell silent, and every alien eye turned toward the human who dared interrupt. Admiral Vethsora fixed him with a look that might have intimidated a lesser officer, but Ethan had faced down admirals before, and he stood his ground. "The human commander may offer observations," she said, and her tone made it clear she expected nothing useful. "Your strategy assumes the Vorn will behave rationally," Ethan began, and he stepped forward toward the display and pointed at the defensive formation, "and you expect them to see their losses mounting and reconsider their attack. But your own reports show they never do that, and they just keep coming until there is nothing left to consume. Commander named Krathvor made a sound of contempt, and his massive scaled body shifted with irritation. And he said, "Humans have never faced the Vorn, and your arrogance is noted, and your inexperience makes your opinions worthless." Ethan turned to face the Dreth, and he did not flinch from the creature that stood 3 meters tall, and could probably tear him apart with bare hands. "You are right. We have never faced the Vorn," he said, "but we have faced enemies who outnumbered us and outgunned us and should have destroyed us. And we are still here because we learned that sometimes the only way to win is to attack when everyone else is telling you to defend." He pulled up human military history on the display and showed them battles from Earth where smaller forces had defeated larger ones through aggression and surprise and willingness to take risks that seemed insane to more cautious minds. "We do not know how to fight any other way," Ethan said, "but it has kept us alive." The debate continued for hours, and Vetsora reluctantly agreed to incorporate some of his suggestions, though her skepticism remained visible in every word and every gesture. And Ethan knew that when the battle came, the Council forces would fall back on their training and their instincts, and his words would be forgotten. But his people would not forget. Maya was waiting for him when he returned to the Endurance, and she could see the frustration in his face, and she did not ask how the briefing had gone, because the answer was obvious. The Vorn arrived at dawn by the local star, and their ships emerged from faster-than-light travel in waves that seemed endless, and they were massive organic constructs that looked like something from a nightmare, and they absorbed light rather than reflected it, and they came forward without hesitation or fear. The battle began with the Council fleet firing coordinated volleys that lit up the darkness like artificial suns, and the Vorn absorbed the damage and kept coming, and 3 Kalari cruisers died in the first 10 minutes, and then 5 more. And then the defensive line began to waver. Ethan watched the tactical display and saw the mathematics of defeat playing out exactly as he had predicted, and he knew that if someone did not change the equation, then everyone would die here today. "All human vessels break formation," he ordered, "and execute attack pattern Omega-7. Maya looked at him with wide eyes, because she knew what that order meant, and she said, "Sir, that is a close-quarters assault pattern, and against those numbers, we will be torn apart." "Trust me," Ethan said, and his voice carried a certainty he did not entirely feel. But leadership sometimes meant pretending confidence you did not have. The human ships surged forward and dove into the Vorn formation, where the larger Council vessels could not follow, and they weaved between the massive enemy constructs, like insects around giants, and they targeted weak points that the Vorn had never bothered to protect, because no one had ever been crazy enough to get close enough to exploit them. Lieutenant Jake Morrison led a fighter wing directly toward a Vorn command ship, and his voice came over the communication channel, calm and steady, as he reported, "Enemy vessel targeted, and we are going in." Maya tracked his squadron on her display, and watched them fly straight into the command ship hangar bay. And she understood what they were doing a moment before the explosion tore the Vorn vessel apart from the inside. No one from that squadron survived, but the Vorn line wavered for the first time in the history of this war, and the Council forces saw it happen, and something changed in them, and they began to push forward instead of holding their positions. The battle lasted 6 more hours, and when it ended, the Council fleet had held the Paris system, and the Vorn had retreated, and for the first time in recorded history, someone had stopped their advance. But the cost was staggering, and Ethan stood on a bridge scarred by weapons fire, and read the casualty reports, and 60% of the human expeditionary force had been destroyed, and thousands of names scrolled across his screen, and each one was a person who had trusted him to lead them, and who would never go home. That Sora transmission came through, and the Kalari Admiral voice carried something that had not been there before. And she said, "Commander Cole, what your people did today will not be forgotten, and I do not have words in your language to describe what I witnessed." Ethan looked at the debris field where so many of his people had died, alongside allies who had doubted them, and he said, "Make sure it was not for nothing." Maya found him later in the empty mess hall, and he was sitting alone with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, and she sat across from him and waited. "Their families," he said finally, "and I keep thinking about all the people back on Earth who are going to get messages telling them their sons and daughters are not coming home, and I gave the orders that killed them." "You gave the orders that saved everyone else," she said, "and Jake Morrison knew what he was doing when he flew into that ship, and they all knew, and they chose to do it anyway." "That does not make it easier." "No," Maya agreed, "and it never will, and that is how you know you are still human." The galaxy learned what happened at Pereth, and the story spread from world to world and species to species, and people who had never thought about humans before began to speak their name with something that sounded like respect. But Ethan did not care about respect, and he only cared about winning this war, and making sure that all those deaths meant something, and he began planning for the next battle before the fires of the first one had even finished burning. Word of the Battle of Pereth spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass, and suddenly humans were no longer the primitive newcomers that the Council tolerated out of politeness. Suddenly they were the species that had done what no one else could do, and stopped the unstoppable Vorn. Admiral Hayes authorized additional deployments, and volunteers flooded recruitment centers on Earth and every colony. People who had lived quiet lives decided that quiet was no longer enough when the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. Ethan found himself promoted to Fleet Admiral, and given command of a growing force of human ships that now operated alongside Council vessels as equals rather than afterthoughts. And the Kalari began sharing technology they had withheld for 30 years, and the Dreth, who had dismissed humans as weak, requested joint training exercises. But the Vorn adapted, because they always adapted, and the intelligence reports showed them changing their tactics, and reinforcing their weak points, and preparing for the next engagement with lessons learned from their first defeat. The next major battle would come at the Saurus Nebula, where a Vorn armada, twice the size of the Pereth force, was gathering to strike at the industrial heartland of the Council, and everyone knew that if that attack succeeded, then the war would be lost. Ethan studied the intelligence for days, and he developed a strategy that made the Council commanders uncomfortable, because it required something that no one had ever attempted before, and that was a ground assault on a world the Vorn had already consumed. Captain Hannah Blake was 34 years old, and she had joined the Marines because her father had been a Marine and his father before him, and when Admiral Cole asked for volunteers to lead the first wave onto Vorn-controlled territory, she stepped forward without hesitation. The planet was called Veth Prime, and the Vorn had taken it 3 years earlier, and consumed every living thing on its surface, and transformed it into something that served their collective, and the Council had written it off as lost forever. Hannah led her Marines down through atmosphere that burned with strange colors, and they landed on a surface that felt wrong beneath their boots, and everything around them was organic and pulsing and alive in ways that made her skin crawl. Her second-in-command was a sergeant named Danny Reeves, and he had grown up on a farm in Kansas, and he had never imagined he would be walking through alien corridors that seemed to breathe, and watching walls that moved like living flesh. "What is this place?" he asked, and his voice was steady, but she could hear the fear underneath. "This is what happens when the Vorn win," Hannah said, "and this is what happens to every world they touch, and this is why we have to stop them." They pushed deeper into the structure, and fought through defenses that seemed to grow from the walls themselves, and they lost Marines with every corridor and every chamber, and Hannah kept moving forward, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant failing everyone who was counting on them. And then they found something that changed everything. In the deepest part of the Vorn structure, they discovered chambers filled with bodies that were not quite dead, and beings from dozens of species hung suspended in organic pods, and their eyes were open but empty, and tubes connected them to the walls and ceiling. "Danny, what am I looking at?" Hannah whispered, and she approached one of the pods, and inside was a Kellari woman whose silver skin had turned gray and whose forearms hung limp at her sides. Sergeant Reeves checked his scanner, and his face went pale, and he said, "Captain, these people are alive, and their brain activity is off the charts, and they are connected to something." Hannah understood then what the Vorn truly were, who consumed worlds and left nothing behind, and instead they were harvesters who absorbed populations into their collective consciousness and kept them trapped between life and death forever. She opened a communication channel to Admiral Cole, and static filled her ears, but she pushed through and said, "Admiral, they are still in there, and all the people from the worlds the Vorn consumed, and they are still alive, and they are fighting." Ethan received her transmission on the bridge of his flagship, and he stared at the data she was sending, and he realized that the mathematics of this war had just changed completely. The Council commanders urged him to destroy Veth Prime from orbit, because that was the safe choice, and that was the logical choice, and that was what any reasonable commander would do. But Ethan was not reasonable, and he ordered a full-scale liberation operation, and he sent every Marine they had down to that nightmare world to save people who had been written off as dead. The battle lasted 9 days, and human soldiers fought through organic corridors alongside something unexpected, and the trapped consciousnesses of the absorbed began fighting back from inside the Vorn network, and they sabotaged systems and disrupted communications and created openings that the Marines exploited. Hannah lost half her unit in those 9 days, and Danny Reeves died holding a corridor so that a group of freed Kellari could escape, and she carried his dog tags in her pocket for the rest of her life. But when it ended, 300,000 beings walked free from Vorn captivity, and among them were members of species the Council had believed extinct, and families who had been separated for years found each other in the refugee camps, and the galaxy witnessed something it had never seen before. Maya found Ethan in his quarters after the liberation, and he was sitting alone and staring at casualty reports, and she recognized the weight in his eyes, because she had seen it before. "The Council is calling it a miracle," she said, "and they are saying humanity has done the impossible." "We did what needed to be done," Ethan replied, and he set down the datapad and turned to face her, and she could see how tired he was and how much this war was costing him. "We lost 8,000 Marines on that planet," he said, "and 8,000 people with families and dreams and futures, and they are gone because I decided their lives were worth risking." "You gave 300,000 people their lives back," Maya said, "and you proved that the Vorn can be beaten in ways no one imagined." "That does not make the math work," he said, "and it never does. And every night I see their faces, and I remember their names, and I wonder if I made the right choice." She sat beside him, and they were quiet for a long time, and finally she said, "The right choice is not always the easy choice, and sometimes you have to decide what kind of person you want to be, and what kind of species we want to be." Ethan looked at her, and he saw the strength in her eyes that he sometimes forgot he had himself, and he said, "We keep fighting because that is who we are, and we keep saving people because that is what we do, and we keep going forward because going back is not an option." The freed consciousnesses provided intelligence that the Council had never had before, and they revealed Vorn weaknesses and communication methods and the locations of their core systems, and the war that had seemed unwinnable began to shift in a direction no one had expected. And across the galaxy, beings who had never thought twice about humans began to understand that these strange, stubborn creatures for the small blue world were going to change everything. The liberation of Veth Prime transformed the war in ways that went beyond military strategy. And the galaxy had found something it had lost long ago, and that something was hope. And hope was more powerful than any weapon. Ethan convened a summit on the neutral world of Kethis, and brought together military commanders from every council species. And they gathered in a great hall beneath a dome that showed the stars above. And for the first time in 30 years, humans stood at the center instead of the edges. Admiral Threnka of the Dreth approached Ethan before the summit began, and the massive scaled warrior who had once dismissed humans as beneath notice now looked at him with something like reverence. "I served 70 years believing my people were the galaxy's finest warriors," Threnka said. "And I watched the Vorn destroy everything we sent against them, and I thought the end had come for all of us. And then I watched your species charge into darkness without fear, hesitation." Ethan nodded and waited because he could see the Dreth had more to say. "I was wrong about humans," Threnka continued, "and strength is not only in the body, and it is not only in weapons and ships and numbers, and true strength is in the spirit that refuses to surrender, even when surrender is the only logical choice." The summit lasted 3 days, and during that time, the old divisions began to crumble, and the prejudices that had kept humanity marginalized for 3 decades fell away like dead leaves in autumn, and something new grew in their place. The Kalari formally proposed elevating humanity to full partnership status within the Galactic Council, with voting rights equal to the founding species, and the vote passed unanimously. And when the result was announced, a cheer went up from the human delegation that echoed through the Great Hall. But there was no time for celebration, because intelligence from the freed minds revealed a terrible truth, and the Vorn were preparing their final offensive, and they were going to attack 12 systems simultaneously. And one of those systems was Earth. Ethan returned home for the first time in 2 years, and the planet he found was not the planet he had left, and everything had changed, and the people had changed most of all. Human children played games in the streets, pretending to be Marines liberating captured worlds, and they shouted orders to each other, and charged at imaginary Vorn with toy weapons, and their parents watched with pride and fear mixed together. The names of those who had fallen were inscribed on monuments in every major city, and people left flowers, and candles, and handwritten notes, thanking the dead for their sacrifice. And Ethan walked past one of those monuments, and saw the name Jake Morrison carved in stone. And he stood there for a long time. His sister Diane met him at the spaceport, and she had never approved of his military career, and they had argued about it since they were teenagers, and she had told him that violence was never the answer, and that fighting only led to more fighting. But now she embraced him without words, and held him tight, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I was wrong," she said. "I thought fighting was the problem, and I thought we could talk our way out of anything, and I did not understand that sometimes fighting is the only answer." Ethan held his sister and felt the years of distance between them dissolve, and he said, "Fighting is not the only answer, and it is the last answer when everything else has failed, but when you reach that point, you have to be willing to give everything." The defense of Earth brought together the largest fleet ever assembled, and ships from 97 species gathered above the pale blue world that had produced these strange, stubborn beings. And the formation stretched across the solar system like a wall of light and metal. Bridge of the Endurance beside Ethan, and watched the fleet take position, and she thought about how far they had come since that first journey to Pereth, and how many friends they had lost along the way. The Kalari ambassador who had first come to Earth asking for help was now commanding a battle group that answered to human tactical control, and she no longer spoke to humans with condescension, and she spoke to them as equals and as friends. The Vorn came in numbers that darkened the solar system, and their ships blotted out the stars, and they advanced in waves that seemed endless, and the battle for Earth began with a fury that shook the fabric of space itself. Ethan commanded from the bridge of the Endurance until the ship was crippled by enemy fire, and then he transferred to a Kalari cruiser and continued fighting, and when that vessel fell, he moved to a Dreth battleship and kept going, because stopping was not an option. The battle lasted 3 weeks, and during that time Ethan slept in 2-hour intervals, and ate when someone put food in front of him. And he made decisions that cost lives and saved lives, and he carried the weight of every death on his shoulders. Hannah Blake led Marine boarding parties onto Vorn vessels, and fought through organic corridors that reminded her of Veth Prime. And she lost soldiers with every engagement. But she kept pushing forward, because giving up meant losing everything. On the 15th day, the Vorn broke through the defensive line and reached Earth orbit. And for 6 terrible hours they bombarded the surface, and cities burned, and millions died. And Ethan watched from the bridge of a borrowed ship and felt his heart break. But the fleet regrouped and counterattacked and pushed the Vorn back, and the battle continued, and humanity refused to fall. On the 21st day, the Vorn did something they had never done before, and they retreated from a target system, and their ships turned and fled back toward the darkness from which they had come. And the defenders of Earth watched them go and could not quite believe what they were seeing. The cost was immense, and millions were dead, and hundreds of ships were destroyed, and the scars would take generations to heal. But Earth survived, and humanity survived, and the alliance that had formed around this small, stubborn species had held. Maya found Ethan after the battle ended, and he was standing alone on an observation deck, watching the debris field that had been a battlefield, and she stood beside him, and they were quiet for a long time. "We did it," she said finally, "and we actually did it." Ethan nodded, but there was no triumph in his eyes, and there was only exhaustion and grief and the weight of everything they had lost. "The galaxy will remember this day," he said, "and they will remember what we did here, and they will tell stories about the humans who refused to let their world fall." Maya looked at him and saw the cost of it. Leadership written in every line of his face, and she said the galaxy will remember, but more importantly, we will remember, and we will make sure it meant something. Below them, Earth turned slowly in the darkness, and the lights of cities that had survived shone like stars, and somewhere down there, people were beginning to rebuild and beginning to hope again. And across the galaxy, beings of every species spoke the name of humanity with something that sounded like awe. The war continued for another decade after the defense of Earth, but its outcome was no longer in doubt, and the alliance that had formed around humanity pushed the Vorn back, system by system and world by world, until the enemy that had once seemed unstoppable was cornered in the dark regions where they had first emerged. Ethan Cole led the campaign from the front, because he had never learned how to command from safety, and he visited every hospital ship and attended every memorial service, and he remembered the name of every soldier who died under his command. Maya Torres rose through the ranks beside him and became his second in command, and she watched him grow older and more tired with each passing year, but his spirit never wavered and his determination never faltered. The final assault on the last Vorn stronghold came on a spring morning by Earth reckoning, and the Allied fleet gathered at the edge of the dark region where no ship had ever ventured, and waited for the order to advance. Ethan stood on the bridge of a new flagship named Defiance, and looked out at the assembled fleet, and saw ships from every council species flying in formation. And he thought about how far they had come since that first desperate battle at Pereth. Admiral Thren Ka of the Dreth commanded the left flank, and the Kelari held the right, and humans held the center. And together, they represented something that had never existed before in the history of the galaxy. He opened a communication channel to the entire fleet, and his voice reached millions of beings across thousands of ships, and he spoke the words he had carried in his heart since this war began. "We did not ask for this fight," he said, "and we did not seek out this enemy, and we would have been happy to live in peace and explore the stars and build a future for our children. But the Vorn gave us no choice, and they forced us to become what we are." He paused and looked around the bridge at the faces of his crew and saw humans and Kalari and Dreth working side by side. "Today we end this war," he continued, "and today we show the galaxy that darkness cannot triumph over light, and that fear cannot defeat courage, and that together we are stronger than anything that stands against us." The fleet advanced into the darkness, and the final battle began. And it was the largest engagement in the history of the Galactic Council, and ships died by the hundreds on both sides, and the void filled with fire and debris. Ethan commanded from the center of the formation, and directed the battle with the skill he had learned over years of war. He watched the Vorn defenses crumble, their ships scatter, and their stronghold come into range. But the Vorn had one final weapon, and a massive vessel emerged from the heart of their territory. And it was larger than anything the Alliance had ever seen, and it began cutting through the fleet like a blade through cloth. The only way to stop it was to reach its core and destroy it from within, and Ethan knew what he had to do. "Maya," he said, and she turned to look at him, and she saw the decision in his eyes. "No," she said, "and there has to be another way." "There is not," he replied, "and you know there is not. And someone has to do this, and it has to be me." She wanted to argue, but she knew he was right, and she had served beside him long enough to know that when he made up his mind, nothing could change it. "You cannot ask me to watch you die," she said, and her voice broke on the last word. "I am not asking you to watch," he said, "and I am asking you to finish this, and I am asking you to lead them home, and I am asking you to make sure the galaxy remembers why we fought." He gave her command of the fleet, and took a small assault ship, and flew toward the Vorn vessel, with a skeleton crew of volunteers, who knew they would not return. And Maya watched him go, and felt her heart shatter into pieces. The core of the Vorn vessel, and fought through defenses that should have been impossible to breach. But he had spent his entire life doing impossible things, and he reached the central chamber, where the heart of the collective pulsed with dark energy. He planted the charges and set the timer, and in the final moments before the explosion, he thought about Earth and about Maya, and about all the people he had served beside, and all the people who had died believing in him. The explosion tore the Vorn vessel apart, and the shockwave rippled through the enemy fleet, and without their command ship, the Vorn scattered and fled, and the war that had lasted more than a decade ended in a flash of light. Maya watched the explosion from the bridge of the Defiance, and she felt Ethan disappear from the universe, and she stood there in silence, while the crew around her celebrated victory. Fleet Admiral Ethan Cole was 63 years old when he died, and he had given everything he had to. A cause he believed in, and he had never asked for recognition or reward, and he had only asked that his sacrifice mean something. The galaxy mourned him as they had never mourned a human before, and the Kalari declared a day of silence across their entire civilization. And the Dreth composed war songs in his honor that would be sung for centuries. And even the Vethmora, who rarely interacted with physical beings, manifested to attend his memorial. Maya delivered the eulogy on Earth, while billions watched across 100 worlds. And she spoke about the man she had served beside, and the leader she had followed, and the friend she had loved. "Ethan used to say that humanity did not know any other way to fight," she said, "and that we charged forward because we did not understand when to retreat. And he was wrong about that, and we understood, and we just chose not to." She paused and looked out at the assembled dignitaries from dozens of species. Some things are worth more than survival, she continued, and some causes are worth dying for, and some battles can only be won by those willing to lose everything. And that is what Ethan taught us, and that is what humanity showed the galaxy. A year after the war ended, the Galactic Council erected a monument on Kethis, and it depicted beings from every species standing together, and at the center was a human marine with hand outstretched, helping a fallen Kalari to their feet. The inscription read, "To fight alongside humanity is to be revered and respected beyond worlds." Maya attended the dedication as Fleet Admiral of the Allied forces, and afterward, a Kalari elder approached her and said, "Your species changed us, and you reminded us what courage and sacrifice truly mean." Maya looked at the monument and thought about Ethan and Hannah and Jake and all the others who had given everything, and she said, "We did not set out to change anything, and we just did what humans do, and we fought for what we believed in. We stood with our friends, and we refused to give up." The elder nodded and said, "That is why across every world we have ever touched, humanity is revered, and not because you were stronger or smarter, but because you showed us what it means to care about something beyond yourselves." The monument stands to this day, and in the halls of power on 100 worlds, and in the academies where young beings learn the arts of war and peace, the lesson endures. And that lesson is simple. To fight alongside humanity is to be revered and respected beyond worlds.